What kind of father builds a maze beneath his mansion and locks his blind daughter inside? And what if the only soul who dares to save her is a dog? This story broke something in me. The cold calculation of Victor, the eerie silence of that underground labyrinth, and the heartbreaking loyalty of Cooper. It stayed with me long after the final scene. But here's the thing. I'm not just here to tell you what I felt. I want to know what you think. Which moment hit you hardest? What would you have done if you were Grace or Cooper? Let me know down in the comments. And don't skip the end. I've left a small gift there just for you. Now let's get back to this story and see how it all unfolds. She was dressed in a simple, almost utilitarian tunic and trousers, threadbare in places, a stark contrast to the opulent decay of the Beaumont lineage. Her small, pale hand, knuckles white, clutched a worn white cane, its tip restlessly tapping the uneven flagstones as a shiver racked her thin frame. Her blindness, a congenital veil over her world since birth, or so she had always been told, rendered the visual horrors of her surroundings moot. But every other sense screamed of confinement and menace. Behind her, a looming, inescapable presence, stood Victor Beaumont, her father, a man carved from granite and shadows. His tall, imposing figure seemed to absorb what little errant light dared to penetrate this subterranean vestibule. His face, a study in controlled neutrality, was typically unreadable, though occasionally a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile, cold and laden with some dark, unfathomable amusement, would touch the corners of his thin lips. He was a former titan in the shadowy world of elite security and covert operations, a realm where human fallibility was a sin and the forging of extraordinary individuals through relentless, brutal pressure was not just a methodology, but an obsession. This obsession now had a singular, chilling focus, Grace, the true, twisted wellspring of Victor's grotesque patience, his sustained, multi-year campaign of torment disguised as tutelage, lay buried within the complex, ironclad will of Grace's deceased mother before succumbing to an illness that had mirrored the slow decay of the Beaumont estate itself. She had, in a desperate, perhaps misguided attempt to protect her daughter, or to force Victor into some semblance of paternal care, stipulated a peculiar condition. Grace would only inherit a separate, vast, and entirely untouchable fortune, a fortune that Victor, for all his cunning, could not directly access. Upon successfully navigating a series of formative challenges, the design, interpretation, and ultimate judgment of these trials were left with a chilling ambiguity that Victor had gleefully exploited, entirely to his discretion. Grace was not just his daughter. She was his project, his key. Victor's voice, when it came, was like the snap of glacial ice, devoid of warmth, resonant with an unyielding, steely authority. Inside, Grace. Today's lesson is about to commence. Grace flinched as if struck. Her head, with its cascade of dark, unkempt hair, bowed lower. Her white cane tapped a frantic, irregular rhythm against the cold stone. "Father," she began, her voice a mere whisper, trembling like a hummingbird's wings, laced with the raw, familiar terror that was her constant companion in his presence. "Please, I'm so terribly afraid. It's so profoundly dark in there, Father, and the cold. It seeps right through me. Can I please, I beg you, can I not go in today?" Her plea dissolved into a near inaudible sob. "I promise, Father, I truly promise I'll study my Braille texts with more diligence. I'll practice my sensory exercises for longer. I'll listen to your instructions more attentively. Anything but in there." Victor remained utterly unmoved, a graven idol of paternal indifference. "Do not squander my time with these Theatrics. Grace, he stated, his tone flat, cutting. That door will not magically unlatch itself for your convenience. Your mother's legacy, your future, is not forged from cowardice. With a swift, almost impersonal movement, he placed a heavy hand on her small shoulder and propelled her forward. The heavy iron door groaned open on protesting, ancient hinges, revealing an abyss of impenetrable blackness beyond. He gave her a final, firm push. Grace stumbled, her cane clattering briefly as she fought for balance. Then the door slammed shut with a deafening, metallic clang that echoed through the subterranean chambers. The distinct, chilling sound of multiple heavy bolts being shot home followed, each click a nail in the coffin of her hope. She was alone, enveloped in the absolute, suffocating darkness of the labyrinth Victor had constructed in the bowels of their ancestral home, not far from the imposing entrance to this man-made hell. In a small, fortified antechamber, another creature shared Grace's distress. Cooper, a magnificent Labrador retriever, whose official designation was Grace's highly trained guide dog, but whose true role in her life was that of unwavering friend, confidant, and sole source of unconditional affection, had been forcibly separated from his charge. Victor, with calculated cruelty, had dragged him here earlier, locking him into the reinforced room. The dog's acute hearing had picked up every nuance of the preceding exchange, the cold command in Victor's voice, the heartbreaking, terrified tremor in Grace's pleas, the final, brutal clang of the iron door. A storm of anxious, desperate barks erupted from Cooper, deep, resonant sounds that bounced off the stone walls of his prison. He hurled himself against the unyielding wooden door, scratching frantically, his powerful body thudding against the timber in a desperate, futile attempt to reach the girl he was born and trained to protect. Cooper, silence. Victor's voice, amplified by the acoustics of the stone corridor, roared back, sharp and laced with menace. You will not distract Grace from the imperative focus her lesson demands. The Labrador's frantic barks slowly subsided, a chilling testament to the effectiveness of Victor's brutal conditioning, gradually morphing into a series of low, mournful, utterly helpless whines, a heartbroken threnody that seemed to seep through the very stones of the Beaumont mausoleum. Inside the labyrinth, Grace stood trembling, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The oppressive silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart and the distant, sorrowful sound of Cooper's distress, was almost a physical weight. Then, Victor's voice, disembodied, chillingly calm and devoid of any human emotion, crackled to life from a series of cleverly concealed speakers embedded within the maze's cold, damp walls. Grace, the voice intoned, each syllable precise, measured. Your designated task for this session is, as follows: locate the insulated flask of water. It has been placed at the terminus of the east corridor. You have precisely 1 hour to complete this objective. Do not disappoint my expectations of your progress. And remember the cardinal rule. No histrionics, no futile complaints. Weakness, as you should by now comprehend, will not ensure your survival within these walls, or indeed, beyond them. With a shuddering intake of breath, Grace forced her trembling limbs into motion. Her white cane swept before her, an extension of her own desperate, searching fingers. The stone walls felt icy and slick beneath her touch. The floor, uneven and treacherous, littered with loose stones and unexpected dips. The air was heavy, stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. Every nerve ending in her body was stretched taut, her senses of hearing, touch, and smell magnified to an almost painful degree, desperately trying to compensate for the sight she had never known. Unseen by Grace, yet a silent, unwilling witness to these cruel charades, was Mrs. Alcott, the elderly, gaunt housekeeper of Beaumont Manor, a woman of few words, rendered almost mute by years of service under Victor's oppressive, tyrannical rule. She knew of the labyrinth's existence, of the horrifying lessons inflicted upon the young, blind mistress. Her knowledge was a heavy, corrosive secret, her silence bought with fear and a desperate, unspoken loyalty to the memory of Grace's mother, whom she had served since girlhood. Occasionally, when Victor's attention was diverted, when the risk felt marginally less catastrophic, Mrs. Alcott, her heart aching with a helpless pity, would dare to leave a small, almost imperceptible token for Grace within the labyrinth's oppressive confines, a slightly loosened stone that might offer a better handhold, a tiny, almost invisible scratch mark near a correct turning, once even a single, precious sugar cube wrapped in wax paper, left where she prayed Grace's questing fingers might find it. These small acts of desperate, dangerous compassion were tiny, flickering embers of hope in an overwhelming darkness. Yet they also served to amplify the ever-present tension, the constant, terrifying risk of discovery by Victor, miles above, in a hidden, state-of-the-art control room that was a stark, jarring contrast to the ancient, decaying edifice of the Beaumont estate. Victor Beaumont sat enthroned before a vast bank of high-definition monitors. His demeanor was one of cool, detached, scientific observation. He watched Grace's struggling, shadowy form navigate the labyrinth, her movements captured with unnerving clarity by a network of strategically placed infrared cameras. His fingers moved deftly across a control panel, occasionally zooming in on her face, noting her physiological responses to stress, her hesitations, her small, almost imperceptible triumphs. His past was a tapestry woven with threads of extreme discipline and the relentless pursuit of human perfectibility. A former preeminent expert in advanced security protocols, a consultant to clandestine special operations units where the cultivation of indomitable willpower and the ability to transcend perceived human limitations were not merely valued, but fanatically revered. Victor had internalized these harsh philosophies, twisting them into a grotesque personal dogma. He was a man consumed by an almost pathological obsession with the concept of forging extraordinary individuals, of pushing human endurance to its absolute breaking point and beyond. In Victor's perverted worldview, Grace's congenital blindness was not a tragedy to be mourned or a vulnerability to be sheltered, but rather a unique, compelling challenge. She was his ultimate project, the crucible in which his abhorrent theories would be irrefutably proven. He clung to the pathological belief that extreme, unrelenting pressure, systematically applied, meticulously calibrated, could awaken dormant, latent potentials within her, forcing her other senses to develop to a superhuman acuity, thereby not just compensating for her lack of sight, but ultimately transcending it, making her more. His twisted, dangerous concept of paternal love was inextricably, terrifyingly intertwined with this brutal regimen. To truly love, in his diseased mind, was to relentlessly push the object of that affection into the harshest, most unforgiving circumstances, to force them to evolve, to strengthen, to mature under duress. Grace, his blind daughter, his singular experiment, was the most crucial, most significant test case of his life's work. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable as he calmly, methodically made notations in a leather-bound journal, his pen scratching almost silently in the sterile quiet of the control room. There was no pity in his cold, analytical eyes, no flicker of compassion for the terrified child struggling in the darkness below, only a detached, clinical interest, already anticipating the design and parameters of the next, inevitably more challenging, exercise, as the last vestiges of the day's light surrendered to the encroaching night far above. casting the sprawling Beaumont estate into deep shadow. A corresponding, more profound darkness continued to reign supreme within the subterranean maze. Grace, exhausted, disoriented, and bone-chillingly cold, was still battling her way through the oppressive blackness, her small face streaked with grime and tears, her hope dwindling but not yet entirely extinguished. From his silent, sterile perch, Victor Beaumont continued his relentless, dispassionate surveillance. Just once, as Grace stumbled badly, her cane flying from her grasp, a faint, almost imperceptible, chillingly cold smile briefly touched his lips, and from the fortified antechamber near the labyrinth's entrance, the heartbroken, mournful whines of Cooper, Grace's distant, helpless guardian, still echoed, a lonely, sorrowful counterpoint to the calculated cruelty unfolding in the darkness below. The stage was set, the players in their designated places, the oppressive atmosphere thick with unspoken threats and a gnawing, suffocating suspense. Victor Beaumont observed his daughter's progress, or lack thereof, with the dispassionate scrutiny of a scientist examining a lab rat. Grace was moving too slowly, her white cane sweeping with a hesitant, almost defeated arse. The infrared display showed her small form frequently pausing, her shoulders slumped, a clear telemetry of waning resolve. He pursed his thin lips. The baseline data from this initial phase was adequate, but hardly indicative of the extraordinary awakening he sought. It was time, he clinically concluded, to escalate the stimuli. His entire perverse philosophy hinged on the unshakable conviction that profound, visceral shocks, meticulously applied, were the crucible in which true potential was forged. These weren't mere challenges. They were carefully calibrated sensory bombardments designed to shatter her existing perceptual framework and force the latent, superior, senses to an almost superhuman acuity. His long, pale fingers danced across the illuminated console, deep within the labyrinth. Unseen mechanisms whirred silently into readiness. The first assault was auditory, as Grace cautiously navigated a narrow, oppressively low-ceilinged passage. Her cane suddenly snagged on something taut and almost invisible at ankle height, a tripwire. Instantly, the suffocating silence was annihilated. A cacophony of ear-splitting alarms erupted from hidden speakers, the deafening clang of metal on metal, the high-pitched, disorienting shriek of industrial sirens, and a discordant series of piercing electronic whistles, all seemingly erupting from every direction at once. Grace screamed, a raw, terrified sound swallowed by the mechanical din. She clapped her hands over her ears, dropping her cane, and stumbled backwards, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sheer, unexpected violence of the sound was a physical blow, disorienting her, robbing her of the fragile sense of spatial awareness she had painstakingly constructed. Victor's voice, laced with a chilling, almost bored derision, sliced through the receding blare of the alarms. A distinct lack of circumspection. Grace, one must maintain constant vigilance. Adversaries, or indeed, opportunities, can manifest from any vector, at any moment. He paused, a microbeat of silence before adding, his tone flat. Consider that auditory stimulus, a necessary aid to heighten your alertness. Child? Shaking, Grace fumbled for her fallen cane, her fingers slick with a cold sweat. The metallic tang of fear was coppery on her tongue. She forced herself onward, each tap of her cane now imbued with a new, heightened trepidation. But Victor was far from finished. As she rounded a corner, her cane detecting what felt like a solid, albeit slightly damp, stone floor, a section directly beneath her feet suddenly, without warning, gave way. It wasn't a chasm, but a subtle, sickening tilt, followed by the floor transforming into an expanse of treacherous, unnatural slickness. Simultaneously, a low rumbling sound emanated from concealed grates above, and a deluge of near-freezing water, filled with sharp, jagged shards of ice, cascaded down, instantly soaking her thin clothing, plastering her dark hair to her skull, and turning the already slick floor into a veritable ice rink. She cried out, her feet shooting out from under her. She landed hard on her hip and elbow, the impact jarring through her small frame. A gasp of pain forced from her lungs. The icy water shocked the breath from her, the shards of ice scraping against her skin like tiny, cruel knives. A profound, bone-deep cold began to seep into her, relentless and unforgiving. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, her body racked with violent shivers. To stand was an ordeal. To walk, an invitation to further injury. The sudden, brutal betrayal of the very ground beneath her feet left her disoriented and profoundly fearful of taking another step. Back in his lair, Victor made a precise notation. Subject exhibits marked hesitation following tactile and thermal disorientation. Proprioceptive recalibration required. He waited, allowing the acute discomfort to permeate, then initiated the next exercise. Grace had managed to drag herself to a slightly drier, rougher section of the passage, huddled against a damp wall, trying to chafe some warmth back into her numb fingers. It was then that the new sounds began: a faint, almost imperceptible rustling, then a chorus of tiny, insistent squeaks and the unmistakable, repulsive skittering of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of tiny claws on stone. The sounds grew, multiplied, seemed to be closing in from all sides, echoing in the claustrophobic darkness. Victor, with a flick of a switch, had released a swarm of hungry sewer rats from a series of concealed chutes directly into Grace's section of the maze. Grace's head snapped up, her face a mask of dawning's, uncomprehending terror. The sounds were unmistakable, primal. She could smell their musky, fetid odor. One brushed against her bare ankle, its fur coarse, its passage swift. She let out a blood-curdling scream, scrambling backwards, pressing herself so hard against the unyielding stone wall it felt as if she were trying to merge with it. Her cane, now her only pathetic weapon, flailed wildly, uselessly, in the oppressive blackness. The thought of them, unseen, swarming, their beady eyes glinting in the dark. Her mind so vividly supplied, their sharp teeth, was a torment far exceeding any physical contact. She could feel them, or imagined she could, crawling over her feet, darting through her hair. The ghastly, slithering, unseen menace was pure, distilled psychological horror. They are merely biological variables. Grace, Victor's voice oozed from the speakers, calm, almost conversational, yet utterly devoid of humanity. Learn to differentiate their auditory and olfactory signatures, predict their patterns, adapt, or become overwhelmed. The rats eventually, seemingly, dispersed, their skittering fading into the deeper recesses of the labyrinth. Though the phantom sensation of their presence lingered, a crawling horror on Grace's skin, but Victor offered no respite. He initiated the final sensory assault of this particular lesson. A new layer of sound began to permeate the maze, this time generated by a sophisticated, hidden surround sound system. There were no sudden alarms, but a creeping, insidious tapestry of terrifyingly realistic, three-dimensional audio illusions. The guttural snarl of some unseen, predatory beast seemed to emanate from the passage just ahead. The heart-breaking, despairing sobs of a lost child echoed from her left, morphing into a cackling, demonic laugh that seemed to slither down her spine from directly behind. The source was indeterminable, the effect utterly disorienting and psychologically crushing. Her already frayed auditory senses were overwhelmed, her mind struggling to process the relentless, terrifying barrage. She clapped her hands over her ears, pressing hard, but the sounds seemed to bypass them, resonating directly within her skull. Exhaustion, cold, hunger, and now this relentless psychological warfare pushed her to the very precipice of her endurance. She stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her, and fell heavily, her cane skittering away into the darkness, lost. The new injuries were sharp, immediate, but almost secondary to the profound, soul-crushing despair that was now her dominant sensation. She was cold, soaked to the bone, her stomach a hollow, aching void. The gnawing pangs of hunger and thirst were a constant, agonizing torment. Her strength, both physical and mental, was utterly depleted. There was no fight left in her, only a vast, empty landscape of hopelessness. Grace curled into a tight, fetal ball at the base of a dripping, moss-covered wall, her small body racked with uncontrollable shivers that had nothing and everything to do with the cold. Sobs, dry and racking, tore through her, but no tears came. She was beyond tears. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread of sound, barely audible even to herself, so cold and hungry. Cooper. Oh, Cooper, where are you? Boy, please, please, somebody, help me. Her voice trailed off into a faint, incoherent murmur. Through the unwavering gaze of his infrared monitors, Victor Beaumont witnessed it all: the falls, the terror, the final, pitiful collapse. He made another meticulous entry in his journal. Subject has reached provisional endurance threshold. Physiological distress markers optimal. Note auditory and tactile stimuli appear most effective in eliciting desired stress responses. There was no flicker of pity in his cold, pale eyes, only the detached, unwavering focus of the dedicated researcher. When Grace's whimpers finally ceased, when her small form lay terrifyingly still, he activated the speakers once more, his voice, now sharp, accusatory, devoid of any pretense of pedagogical encouragement, cracked through the silence like a whip. Get up, Grace. Do you hear me? On your feet. Weaklings, sentimentalists. They have no place in the world I am preparing you for. Do you intend to expire in that pathetic, sniveling heap, to succumb so ignominiously? Continue your designated task. Find the objective, or have the courage to consciously accept your abject failure. He paused. Do not dare to expect my intervention. Do not hope for compassion. It is a currency without value. You will save yourself, Grace, or you will perish. The choice, as always, is yours. As Grace lay there, teetering on the very brink of unconsciousness, her numb fingers idly traced the cold, damp stones of the wall beside her. In her despair, almost by accident, one finger hooked into a tiny, almost imperceptible crevice. It wasn't much, but it was different. A slight irregularity in the otherwise smooth, slime-coated surface. A tiny, almost negligible anomaly. Her dulled mind, however, registered it. A flicker of something. Not hope. That was too grand a word. But perhaps a spark of pure, animalistic curiosity, or the last, desperate twitch of a mind seeking any variation in the relentless, horrifying monotony, caused her to explore it further. The stone, she realized, felt slightly looser than its neighbors. Meanwhile, in his stone-walled prison, Cooper's torment mirrored Grace's, albeit in a different form. Her distant, muffled screams, the terrifying, unnatural sounds of the activated traps that even his thick wooden door could not entirely mute, were a constant, agonizing fuel to his desperate frenzy. He could feel her terror, a palpable wave of distress that transcended mere auditory perception, a deep, instinctual connection that bound them, soul to soul. His relentless assault on the main door panel had yielded nothing but bloody paws, a throat raw and hoarse from incessant barking, and a growing sense of agonizing helplessness. But Labradors, particularly those of Cooper's intelligence and breeding, were not creatures to succumb easily to despair. His initial frantic, brute force attacks had abated, replaced by a more focused, almost cunning, series of explorations. His sensitive nose twitched, sampling the air currents, his sharp ears swiveling, analyzing every sound. He remembered the slightly loosened decorative panel near the bottom of the door, the one Grace had so often played with. His earlier, more generalized assaults had further weakened it. Now, he returned to it with a renewed, almost strategic, determination. Ignoring the pain in his raw paws, he began to gnaw, to dig, to pry at the edges of that specific board with a focused intensity that was terrifying in its own right. The labyrinth held Grace in its cold, dark, unyielding embrace. She was perilously close to the end of her endurance, her consciousness beginning to fray, fragmented images and whispered, disjointed phrases from Victor's lessons swirling in the fog of her delirium. Above her, in his sterile sanctuary, Victor Beaumont, his face illuminated by the cold, flickering glow of his monitors, began to calmly input the parameters for the next, significantly more dangerous, phase of his experiment. It would be, he mused with a flicker of something akin to anticipation, the ultimate test, and far away, yet so intrinsically connected. A sliver of splintered wood finally, with a tortured groan, began to give way under Cooper's relentless, desperate assault. A tiny, almost invisible crack of faint, blessed light appeared from the corridor beyond. It was a fragile, almost insignificant breach, but to the imprisoned, devoted dog, it was the first, brilliant, undeniable glimmer of hope in an overwhelming, suffocating darkness. The tension ratcheted, coiling tight, a prelude to a storm that was far from over. In the cold, sterile glow of his subterranean command center, Victor Beaumont reviewed the physiological data streaming from Grace's biomonitor implants. Her heart rate was erratic. Stress hormone levels were critically elevated, and her core body temperature was plummeting. She was, by all clinical metrics, approaching systemic failure. A lesser man, a father with even a vestige of normal human empathy, would have terminated the exercise, would have rushed to his child's aid. Victor, however, saw not a dying daughter, but an experiment nearing a crucial, perhaps final, data point. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of a zealot, that it was precisely at this precipice, this razor's edge between endurance and collapse, that true, extraordinary transformation occurred. He decided it was time to elevate the lesson to its ultimate expression of calculated cruelty, to introduce a final, decisive trial designed to either shatter Grace's last remaining vestiges of resilience or, in his twisted, pathological fantasy, awaken a dormant, preternatural ability through the sheer, unadulterated agony of extreme physical pain. His fingers, long and spidery, moved with chilling precision across the control panel, in a distant, narrow, and pitch-black section of the labyrinth. A section Grace would inevitably be forced to traverse if she continued to seek the elusive and non-existent. In this particular iteration of the lesson water flask, a new horror was being prepared. Concealed mechanisms whirred, or perhaps he dispatched Mrs. Alcott, her face a mask of terrified obedience, under threat of some unspoken but clearly understood consequence. To set the stage, the result was a diabolical gauntlet. Several low, almost invisibly camouflaged wooden planks were embedded into the uneven stone floor, bristling with upturned, razor-sharp shards of broken glass and small, cruelly angled, rust-encrusted nails. They were positioned to be virtually undetectable by a sweeping cane in the disorienting darkness, especially to someone as exhausted and traumatized as Grace. His voice, now imbued with a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of dark, anticipatory excitement, slithered from the hidden speakers, coiling around Grace in the oppressive blackness. This, Grace, represents the culminating examination of today's curriculum, a definitive test of absolute, meticulous caution and the most refined, nuanced sensory perception. The passage immediately confronting you presents a unique topography. Demonstrate to me now, unequivocally, that you are not, as I have occasionally suspected, merely defective material. Exercise absolute, unwavering vigilance, Grace, or you will indeed pay a most significant price. The almost hypnotic, sibilant quality of his words was more terrifying than any shout. Grace, slumped against the cold stone, barely registered the new pronouncement. Her consciousness was a flickering, guttering candle flame, adrift in a sea of pain, cold, and profound exhaustion. The concept of choice, of defiance, had long since been extinguished. She was an automaton, programmed only for obedience, for survival, however fleeting. With an effort that seemed to tear at the very fabric of her being, she pushed herself slowly, agonizingly, to her hands and knees, then, trembling violently, to her feet. Her lost cane was a phantom limb. She was now utterly reliant on the desperate, questing reach of her raw, scraped fingers. She began to shuffle forward, one tentative, painful step at a time, into the waiting, lethal darkness of Victor's final classroom. Her bare foot, numb with cold and previous injuries, came down directly onto one of the hidden planks. There was no warning, no chance to react. The razor-sharp edge of a thick shard of glass, cunningly angled upwards, sliced deeply into the tender arch of her foot, simultaneously impaling it on a rusty nail. A sound, inhuman and horrifying, ripped itself from Grace's throat. It was not a scream of mere terror, but an explosion of pure, unendurable, physical agony, a sound that seemed to tear the very air of the labyrinth to shreds. The pain was a white-hot, blinding nova, eclipsing all other sensations. The cold, the hunger, the fear. In its terrifying, all-consuming immediacies, she collapsed instantly, her small body convulsing, warm, slick blood instantly beginning to pool beneath her on the cold, indifferent stone. Through the searing agony, a single, coherent thought, a desperate, primal cry from the deepest core of her being, managed to fight its way to her lips, a name that was both a plea and a prayer. Cooper. Starbright. Cooper. Oh, God, Starbright. It was their special word, a silly, secret name she'd given him for their private game of Find Me, a game they played in the sunlit gardens so many lifetimes ago, a code that, to Cooper, signified the most urgent, unbreakable summons, that heart-wrenching, pain-filled cry, carrying the unique, desperate signature of her voice and their secret, unbreakable bond, pierced the thick stone walls of Cooper's makeshift prison like an invisible spear. It was the final, undeniable command. Any remaining vestiges of trained restraint, of fear of Victor's wrath, were instantly incinerated in the explosive, overwhelming conflagration of his protective fury. His earlier, more strategic attempts to escape were abandoned. Now, it was pure, instinctual, unstoppable force. With a roar that was more lion than Labrador, he hurled his entire 70-pound body, a solid mass of muscle and desperate love, against the already weakened, splintered wooden panel at the base of the door. The impact was colossal, The tortured wood groaned, cracked, then shattered outwards in an explosion of jagged splinters, ignoring the fresh, searing pain as sharp shards embedded themselves in his shoulder and muzzle. Cooper, with a second, even more powerful lunge, ripped the remnants of the panel from its frame. He was through. He was free. His paws, already bloodied, scrabbled for purchase on the slick stone floor of the corridor outside, his body a coiled spring of unleashed, desperate energy. He paused for a single, infinitesimal microsecond, his magnificent head raised, ears swiveling like radar dishes, his dilated nostrils flaring, drawing in great, shuddering lungfuls of the musty, complex air, Grace's scent, faint but distinct, tainted with the terrifying, new, metallic aroma of fresh blood, pulled at him with an irresistible force. Her last, pain-filled cry, though now silenced, still echoed in his highly attuned auditory memory. He knew, with an unshakable, terrifying certainty, that she was not just afraid. She was hurt. Badly. Then he was gone. A tawny, canine missile launched into the oppressive, disorienting darkness of the labyrinth's entrance. He moved with a speed and agility that seemed almost preternatural, his powerful, thudding paws devouring the uneven ground. A continuous volley of sharp, urgent, almost frantic barks erupted from his raw throat, no longer mournful whines of helpless despair, but a rallying cry, a furious, defiant challenge to the unseen architect of this torment, and a desperate, loving reassurance to Grace that he was coming, that help, however improbable, was on its way. "I'm coming. Grace, hold on. I'm coming." His barks seemed to scream into the unfeeling stone. The labyrinth, designed to disorient and terrify a human child, presented its own unique challenges to a charging Labrador. The lingering, oily residue on the floor from an earlier trap sent him skidding, his claws struggling for purchase. He recoiled with a disgusted snarl from a section still reeking faintly of the terrified rats, his hackles rising. The disorienting, three-dimensional sound effects that had so tormented Grace, the phantom snarls, the demonic laughter, still echoed faintly. But Cooper, his senses laser-focused on the singular, overriding imperative of reaching Grace, seemed to barely register them, or perhaps dismissed them with an instinctual contempt for their artificiality. His objective was singular. Absolute find Grace. Protect Grace, back in the cold, silent hell of the trap-laden corridor. Grace lay in a rapidly expanding pool of her own blood. The initial, searing agony had begun to recede, replaced by a spreading, insidious numbness, a terrifying cold that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature of the maze. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Her consciousness was a fragile, flickering thing, drifting in and out like a failing tide, dimly, through the roaring in her ears, through the fog of encroaching shock. She thought she heard something. A distant, familiar sound. A bark. Or was it just another of her father's cruel auditory illusions? "See, Cooper," she whispered, her voice a faint, dry rustle, barely audible even to herself. Her eyelids fluttered, then closed. In his control room, Victor Beaumont watched the drama unfold on his multiple screens with an expression that was an unholy, almost unreadable, amalgam of incandescent fury and a strange, chillingly detached, scientific curiosity. The dog had breached containment, an unforeseen variable, an unwelcome, infuriating complication. His meticulously designed experiment was being contaminated. His thin lips tightened into a bloodless line. For a moment, his hand hovered over a bank of controls that could activate more definitive deterrence within the maze. But he paused. There was also a flicker of something else in his cold, calculating eyes a perverse, almost clinical interest. How would this new, unexpected dynamic play out? What data could be gleaned from this canine intervention? He decided, for the moment, to observe, to let the variables interact. The sound of Cooper's furious, desperate barking grew louder, closer, echoing through the claustrophobic, intersecting passages of the labyrinth. Each resonant bark a nail hammered into the coffin of Victor's control. Each thud of his powerful paws a drumbeat of impending, desperate hope. The race against death, against the encroaching darkness of Grace's fading life, was on. The hunter had, in a terrifying, unforeseen twist, become the hunted, and an unlikely, four-legged savior was now tearing through the heart of the maze, guided by an unbreakable bond and a love that knew no fear. The air crackled with an almost unbearable, suffocating suspense. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. Guided by an almost supernatural acuity of scent, Cooper tore through the labyrinthine corridors, the metallic tang of Grace's fresh blood a horrifying, irresistible beacon in the oppressive darkness, overriding all other confusing, stale odors. Her faint, almost inaudible whimpers, nearly swallowed by the damp stone, were the accompanying siren song guiding his desperate paws. He skidded to a halt at the entrance to the narrow, shadowed passage where Victor's final, most insidious trap lay sprung. There she was, his Grace, slumped at the base of a slime-streaked wall, her small body curled in on itself, one hand clutching her lower leg, from which a dark, viscous fluid, her lifeblood, was seeping with terrifying steadiness, staining her pale skin and simple clothing a sickening crimson. Her breath was a series of shallow, ragged gasps, her face ashen, her eyes half-closed, dull with pain and encroaching shock, with a sound that was a heartbreaking amalgam of canine grief and profound relief. Cooper was beside her in an instant. He whined, a low, sorrowful threnody, his warm breath misting on her cold cheek. He nudged her gently with his broad muzzle. Then, with an instinct as old as time, began to tenderly, almost reverently, lick at the edges of the bleeding wound on her leg, his rough tongue a futile, desperate attempt to cleanse and staunch the flow. Then, he pressed his large, warm body firmly against hers, a living, breathing blanket, desperately trying to share his own vital warmth, to ward off the insidious chill that was claiming her. Grace, drifting on the murky, terrifying tides of semi-consciousness, felt the familiar, beloved pressure, smelled the unique, comforting scent of her Cooper, a flicker of awareness, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness of her pain and fear, ignited within her. "See Cooper," she breathed, her voice a fragile, barely audible whisper. With an immense, agonizing effort, she managed to lift a trembling arm, her fingers weakly tangling in the thick fur of his neck. She buried her face against his warm, comforting flank, a single, dry sob escaping her lips. For a fleeting, precious moment, a sliver of perceived safety, however illusory, pierced through her agony. The fragile tableau was brutally shattered. Victor Beaumont, his face a contorted mask of incandescent, almost apoplectic rage, appeared at the far end of the narrow corridor. He had seen, via his monitors, the dog's successful breach, its infuriating reunion with his subject. The sight had triggered something primal, something that overrode his usually meticulous, cold calculation. His experiment was not only contaminated, it was being actively defied. In his hand, He now gripped a heavy, leather-wrapped truncheon, a relic from his more direct security engagements. "You insolent cur," he roared, his voice no longer the calm, disembodied pronouncement of the speakers, but the raw, guttural snarl of an enraged beast. The sound bounced off the narrow stone walls, amplifying its terrifying intensity. "Who gave you permission to exit your designated confinement? Grace, get to your feet, girl. This lesson is not concluded. Your insubordination will be addressed." He advanced, his heavy boots thudding ominously on the stone. The truncheon held menacingly. He aimed a vicious kick towards Cooper, intending to drive the dog away from the girl. "Get away from her, you filthy animal!" Cooper, with a speed and ferocity that belied his usually gentle nature, met Victor's advance not with retreat, but with a deep, chest-rumbling growl that was pure, undiluted menace. He scrambled to his feet, planting himself squarely between Grace and her tormentor, his body a quivering shield of protective fury, his lips peeled back, revealing a formidable array of sharp, white teeth. He was no longer a guide dog, a companion. He was a guardian, a warrior, prepared to defend his charge to the death. He skillfully sidestepped another clumsy, rage-fueled kick, his barks now sharp, staccato, and utterly defiant. The scene descended into a chaotic, desperate struggle in the narrow, dimly lit confines. Victor, his face flushed, his breath coming in harsh gasps, rained blows down with the truncheon, aiming for the dog. But Cooper, with incredible agility, dodged and weaved, snapping and snarling, always keeping his body between Victor and the terribly vulnerable, bleeding child. During one particularly violent lunge from Victor, as the truncheon whistled perilously close to his head, Cooper saw his chance. It wasn't an attack. It was something far more calculated, far more intelligent. He lunged, not for Victor's arm or leg, but for Grace's tunic, specifically for a section near her wounded leg that was heavily saturated with her fresh, warm blood. His teeth closed gently but firmly on the fabric. Then, in a breathtaking display of speed and cunning, as Victor momentarily overbalanced from his missed swing, Cooper pivoted. He ripped the blood-soaked swatch of fabric free, with the precious, damning evidence clamped firmly in his jaws. He feinted left, then darted right, a tawny blur, and shot past Victor, out of the treacherous corridor and back into the main artery of the labyrinth, his paws scrabbling for traction as he disappeared into the oppressive darkness. Victor stared, dumbfounded for a split second, at the empty space where the dog had been. Then, a wave of apoplectic, almost insane fury washed over him. The dog had not only defied him, protected the girl, but had now escaped, with evidence. "No," he bellowed, the sound echoing through the empty passages, a roar of pure, thwarted rage. "You will not ruin this." Cooper, meanwhile, was navigating the labyrinth with a new, desperate urgency. The scent of Grace's blood on the fabric in his mouth was a potent, driving force, but his objective now had shifted. He was no longer just trying to reach Grace. He was trying to escape, to bring help. His superior canine senses, honed by years of Victor's own cruel training in this very maze, now served a different purpose. He remembered turns, a slight draft from a ventilation shaft he'd noticed on previous, less frantic explorations, a section of wall near the mausoleum entrance that had always sounded hollower than the rest. He ran, a silent, determined shadow, the only sounds his panting breath and the soft thud of his paws, the bloody fabric, a grim banner clenched in his jaws. He found it, a narrow, almost invisible maintenance tunnel, one Victor had long considered sealed, but which time and neglect had rendered marginally accessible. He squeezed through, emerging not into the sterile antechamber of his earlier prison, but into a disused, cobweb-filled storage cellar beneath the main Beaumont mansion itself. From there, it was a short, frantic dash up a flight of rickety wooden stairs, through a forgotten service door, and out into the pre-dawn chill of the estate grounds. He didn't pause. He ran, his powerful legs eating up the distance, past the manicured lawns, the ornate, silent fountains, towards the distant, reassuring glow of lights from the nearest neighboring property. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and an observant nature, had often found herself casting uneasy glances towards the imposing, somewhat forbidding Beaumont estate. She'd heard things, over the years, strange, muffled cries late at night, the almost constant, mournful barking of the beautiful Labrador she occasionally saw with the blind Beaumont girl during their infrequent, chaperoned walks. She had always dismissed them as products of an overactive imagination or the eccentricities of the wealthy and reclusive. Tonight, however, there was no dismissing the sheer, unadulterated terror in the series of frantic, percussive barks that suddenly erupted at her front door, accompanied by a desperate, furious scratching that threatened to splinter the wood. Heart pounding, she peered through the peephole. It was Cooper, the Beaumont dog, but a Cooper she had never seen before. Wild-eyed, mud-streaked, his flank matted with what looked like blood, and there was something in his mouth. She flung the door open. Cooper, oh my heavens, Cooper, what on earth is wrong with you, boy? Her voice was sharp with alarm. The dog whined, a high-pitched, desperate sound, and then, with a sense of profound, almost theatrical urgency, he dropped the sodden, crimson-stained piece of fabric at her feet. He nudged it with his nose, then looked up at her, his intelligent eyes filled with an unbearable, eloquent plea. Mrs. Peterson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She recognized the delicate floral pattern of the fabric, Grace's, and the dark, viscous stain. There was no mistaking it. This is Grace's tunic. And that's blood. Oh, dear Lord in heaven. Grace, Cooper, has something terrible happened to Grace? Cooper barked once, a short, affirmative, desperate sound, then spun, racing a few paces towards the Beaumont estate, looking back at her, urging her to follow. Mrs. Peterson, a woman of action despite her years, didn't hesitate for a second. She snatched up her phone, her fingers already dialing 911, her voice, though trembling, clear and concise as she reported a suspected emergency, a child possibly gravely injured, at the Beaumont residence. As the first wail of distant sirens began to pierce the pre-dawn quiet, Cooper, having successfully delivered his desperate message, did not wait. He turned and, with a fresh burst of adrenaline, raced back towards the dark, looming silhouette of the Beaumont mansion, the bloody fabric now forgotten. His mission was not yet complete. The police patrol cars, lights flashing, sirens now screaming, screeched to a halt at the imposing wrought-iron gates of the Beaumont estate. They found them unlocked. As they proceeded cautiously up the long, sweeping driveway, Cooper, a mud-streaked, still agitated dervish, met them, barking furiously, then turning and leading them, with unshakable determination, towards the main entrance of the house. Victor Beaumont, his face pale but his composure chillingly, unnervingly regained, met them in the grand, marble-floored atrium. He had just emerged from the hidden access point to the mausoleum, a faint, almost imperceptible smear of dirt on his expensive trousers, the only outward sign of his recent subterranean activities. He was in the process of meticulously crafting his contingency narrative. He had, after all, always anticipated the possibility of unforeseen complications. He even had a discreetly installed secondary camera system in some of the upper house areas, its footage easily editable, and a fabricated file detailing an experimental intensive sensory integration therapy he was supposedly administering to Grace, complete with forged consent forms and expert attestations. He raised his eyebrows in a perfect imitation of surprised, yet concerned, inquiry. "Officers? Good heavens, what is all this commotion? Is everything quite all right?" His voice was smooth, solicitous, the epitome of the concerned patriarch. When they mentioned Mrs. Peterson's frantic call, the dog, the blood-stained fabric, he feigned a worried frown. "Ah, yes, poor Cooper. He does get rather excitable, and little Grace, I'm afraid, was just a bit more mischievous than usual this evening. She was exploring. You see, down in some of the older, less used cellar areas. A rather ill-advised adventure, I grant you. And unfortunately, she took a small, rather clumsy tumble in the dark, a few scrapes, a bit of a fright, nothing more, I assure you. The dog, bless his loyal heart, probably got overly alarmed by her crying and managed to get himself out and cause all this unnecessary fuss. He even managed a faint, indulgent chuckle. She's resting now. I was just about to check on her again. His lies, however, delivered with his customary polish, felt off. They were too smooth, too rehearsed. Cooper, still barking insistently at a heavy, antique tapestry that Sarah later identified as concealing the primary, disguised entrance to the mausoleum and labyrinth, was a stark, frantic contradiction to Victor's calm, dismissive reassurances. The sheer, unadulterated terror in Mrs. Peterson's voice on the 911 recording, her description of the blood-soaked fabric, which she had, with commendable presence of mind, carefully placed in a plastic bag and handed to the first responding officer, all of it painted a far more sinister picture. The lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman named Captain Eva Rostova, listened to Victor's placid explanation, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. She looked from Victor's immaculate facade to the frantic, desperate dog, then to the ominous, heavy tapestry. Despite Victor's attempts to present his therapeutic documentation, a folder he produced with almost too much alacrity, Captain Rostova felt a cold knot of professional unease tighten in her gut. Something here was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "With all due respect, given the unusual circumstances and the evident distress of this animal, I believe a more thorough inspection of your property, specifically the areas this dog seems so determined for us to investigate, is warranted. For your daughter's safety, of course." Victor's smile didn't falter, but a tiny, almost invisible muscle began to twitch erratically at the corner of his left eye. His carefully constructed composure was beginning to show the faintest of cracks. He knew, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that they were getting too close. Grace was still down there, bleeding, vulnerable, but if he refused them access now, it would be tantamount to an admission of guilt. The game, he realized with a surge of cold panic, was rapidly, terrifyingly, spinning out of his control. The fate of his experiment, and indeed, his own, now hung precariously, terrifyingly, in the balance. The air in the grand atrium crackled with unspoken suspicion, with the grim promise of horrors yet to be unearthed. Guided by Cooper's unwavering determination and his intermittent, anxious barks that echoed eerily through the oppressive subterranean silence, Captain Rostova and her tactical team, flashlights cutting sharp, probing beams through the inky blackness, plunged into the maw of the labyrinth. The dog, despite his own evident exhaustion and injuries, moved with a desperate, unerring purpose, leading them deeper into the cold, damp, and terrifyingly complex network of passages that Victor Beaumont had engineered as his private torture chamber. The seasoned officers, men and women who believed they had witnessed the full spectrum of human cruelty, found themselves recoiling in barely concealed horror at what they encountered. The air itself felt tainted, heavy with the residue of fear and suffering. They navigated around deviously concealed tripwires, noted the treacherous, unnaturally slick sections of flooring designed to send an unsuspecting victim sprawling, and sidestepped areas littered with the cruel, jagged shards of broken glass and upturned, rust-encrusted nails that glinted malevolently in their flashlight beams. Each discovery was a fresh stab of outrage, a grim testament to the calculated, sadistic cruelty of the labyrinth's architect. Cooper, whining softly, nudged them insistently towards one particularly narrow, shadowed corridor. There, crumpled in a dark, damp corner, they found her. Grace, a small, almost fetal form, lying terrifyingly still in a congealing pool of her own blood. Her simple clothing was torn and soaked, her face ashen, her lips tinged with a disturbing bluish hue. One small hand was still instinctively, weakly, clutching her grievously wounded leg. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the hardened team. A paramedic, part of the entry unit, was beside her in an instant, his movements urgent but gentle as he assessed her vital signs. His voice a low, urgent murmur into his radio. She was alive, but only just, while Grace was carefully stabilized and prepared for immediate emergency evacuation. Captain Rostova ordered a systematic, meticulous sweep of the entire subterranean complex. It was Cooper, once again, who led them, with an almost uncanny prescience, to a heavy, disguised iron door concealed behind a false wall of what appeared to be solid bedrock. Behind it, they discovered Victor Beaumont's sanctum sanctorum, the state-of-the-art, chillingly sterile control room, the bank of monitors, still flickering with live infrared feeds from within the maze, the complex array of switches and levers clearly labeled to activate the various traps, and, most damningly, a series of meticulously kept, leather-bound journals filled with Victor's precise, chillingly detached, pseudo-scientific observations on Grace's reactions to each lesson, each meticulously orchestrated torment. There were even notations on her pain thresholds, her fear responses, her moments of near collapse, all recorded with the cold, clinical objectivity of a vivisectionist, further investigation of the control room's secure computer systems, and a locked safe concealed behind a panel began to unearth evidence of an even wider web of Victor's depravity. Encrypted financial records hinted at systematic embezzlement from his late wife's estate, complex money laundering schemes, and deeply disturbing, coded correspondence with shadowy international entities. There were even early, fragmented research notes and architectural plans for the labyrinth, dating back to a time shortly after Grace's mother had received her terminal diagnosis, suggesting a horrifying, long-term premeditation to his cruelty, perhaps even a sinister, contributing role in the circumstances that led to Grace inheriting the contested portion of her mother's fortune through that cruelly exploitable will. The full, horrifying scope of Victor Beaumont's monstrousness was beginning to unfurl like a venomous serpent. With this mountain of irrefutable, horrifying evidence, the physical state of the labyrinth, Grace's critical injuries, Cooper's blood-stained fur and his own wounds from the escape, the damning contents of the control room, and the silent, eloquent testimony of the blood-soaked fabric Cooper had so bravely delivered. Every one of Victor Beaumont's carefully constructed lies, his feigned concern, his elaborate contingency plans, crumbled into dust. His arrest, this time for a litany of heinous charges, including aggravated child abuse, torture, unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and attempted murder, was executed on the spot, amidst the chilling, silent machinery of his own depraved design. There was no bluster left in him now, only a sallow, stunned silence as the cold steel of handcuffs once again encircled his wrists. The subsequent media explosion was seismic. The Beaumont Labyrinth horror, as the tabloids quickly dubbed it, became a national scandal, an almost gothic tale of unimaginable cruelty hidden beneath the veneers of old-money respectability and philanthropic largesse. The world recoiled at the unmasking of the monster. Victor Beaumont's trial was a grim, protracted affair. The prosecution, led by a steely-eyed district attorney, methodically laid out the overwhelming evidence. Grace, after weeks of intensive care and the initial, fragile stages of psychological stabilization, provided her testimony via a specially arranged, trauma-informed video deposition, her small, quiet voice, though trembling, recounting the horrors with a courage that brought tears to the eyes of hardened court officials. Cooper, present in the courtroom under special judicial dispensation as an emotional support animal for Grace during the viewing of her testimony, lay steadfastly at the feet of Captain Rostova, occasionally letting out a low, soft whine as his beloved Grace's recorded voice filled the tense silence. Mrs. Alcott, the housekeeper, finally, free from Victor's oppressive shadow, provided crucial corroborating testimony about his tyrannical control and her own long-held, terrified suspicions. Mrs. Peterson recounted Cooper's desperate arrival, the journals, the schematics for the labyrinth, the very existence of the control room. It was an avalanche of incontrovertible guilt. Victor's high-priced attorneys could do little more than offer token resistance. He was found guilty on all counts, his face a mask of incredulous, impotent rage as the verdict was read. The judge, in sentencing him to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, spoke of a depravity so profound, so utterly devoid of basic human decency, that it defied comprehension. His name, his lineage, his legacy were forever consigned to the darkest, most reviled annals of criminal infamy. Grace's physical recovery was a long, arduous, and painful marathon. The deep laceration to her foot required multiple surgeries to repair severed tendons and nerves, leaving her with a permanent limp. The prolonged exposure, malnutrition, and repeated physical trauma had taken a severe toll on her young, developing body, but it was the psychological wounds, the invisible, deeply embedded shrapnel of terror and betrayal, that proved the most challenging to heal. Nightmares continued to plague her. The labyrinth's oppressive darkness, a recurring landscape in her dreams, the fear of enclosed spaces, of sudden loud noises, of being touched without warning. These were battles she fought daily. Cooper, hailed by the media and the public as Cooper the Courageous, also required significant veterinary care. His paws were raw and infected from his desperate escape. His shoulder wound from the splintered door was deep, and he bore several painful bruises, likely from Victor's truncheon. Yet, through it all, his primary concern, his unwavering focus, remained Grace, their official reunion. Once Grace was discharged from the hospital to a specialized pediatric trauma recovery center, and Cooper was sufficiently healed, was a moment of such pure, unadulterated, heartbreaking emotion that it left everyone who witnessed it profoundly moved. Grace, still frail, her eyes wide and haunted, but with a tiny, flickering spark of her old self beginning to re-emerge, was sitting in a sunlit therapy room when Cooper was gently led in. He stopped, his great head cocked. Then, with a soft, joyous yelp, he was across the room, showering her with gentle, ecstatic licks, his tail a blur of unrestrained happiness. Grace burst into tears, not of pain or fear this time, but of overwhelming, cathartic relief, her arms wrapping around his thick, furry neck, burying her face in his familiar, comforting scent. "Oh, Cooper," she sobbed, her small body shaking. "Thank you. Thank you, my brave, brave boy. Thank you for not leaving me, for never, ever giving up on me." His presence, his unwavering, unconditional love, became the most potent, most essential medicine in her long, slow journey towards healing. Dr. Evelyn Thorne, a renowned specialist in childhood trauma and animal-assisted therapy, became a pivotal figure in Grace's recovery. She worked patiently, compassionately, not only with Grace, but also with Cooper, recognizing him as an indispensable co-therapist. Together, they navigated the treacherous terrain of Grace's shattered psyche, Cooper's calming presence often enabling Grace to confront and articulate fears that words alone could not reach. As the years passed, Grace, under the loving, dedicated guardianship of a distant maternal aunt, a kind, unassuming woman named Martha, who had been horrified to learn of her niece's ordeal, slowly began to reclaim her life. Cooper, officially recognized and certified as her dedicated medical support and therapy animal, was, of course, an inseparable part of that new life. The nightmares gradually faded, replaced by dreams in which Cooper was always there, a steadfast, furry guardian. Her laughter, once a forgotten sound, began to return, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence and joy. The profound trauma she had endured did not, as Victor had so monstrously intended, break her. Instead, it forged within her an extraordinary, almost preternatural empathy, a deep, abiding compassion for all vulnerable, suffering creatures, both human and animal. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of her being, what she had to do with her life, with the substantial inheritance that was finally, rightfully hers, free from Victor's grasping, malevolent shadow, with Aunt Martha's unwavering support, and the wise counsel of a team of dedicated philanthropists and child welfare advocates. Grace, now a poised, articulate, and remarkably resilient young woman, established the Cooper and Grace Sanctuary for Healing. It was an ambitious, visionary undertaking, a sprawling, welcoming haven nestled in the rolling countryside, designed to be a place of profound healing and recovery for children who had survived abuse and profound trauma. It was also, equally importantly, a state-of-the-art rescue and rehabilitation center for animals rescued from situations of cruelty and neglect, with a specialized program for training therapy dogs to be partnered with children in need. A significant portion of Victor's confiscated assets, following a lengthy legal battle, was ultimately directed by the courts to help fund the sanctuary's endowment. A final, fitting act of restorative justice. Cooper, his muzzle now a distinguished silver, his gait a little slower, a little stiffer, but his amber eyes still shining with that same unwavering, intelligent devotion, became the sanctuary's beloved, four-legged ambassador, its living, breathing soul. He moved among the children with an innate, gentle grace, offering a comforting nuzzle, a patient, listening ear, a warm, furry body to hug, instinctively sensing their pain, their fear, their fragile, emerging hope. He was a constant, powerful reminder of courage, loyalty, and the incredible, boundless capacity of the animal heart to heal and to love. Victor Beaumont, meanwhile, languished in a maximum security federal penitentiary, stripped of his wealth, his power, his very identity. Reports from inside the prison walls painted a portrait of a man unbowed, unrepentant, utterly devoid of remorse, consumed only by a bitter, impotent rage at his downfall, his twisted, narcissistic psyche incapable of comprehending, let alone accepting, the enormity of his crimes. His darkness remained absolute, incurable. One sun-drenched afternoon, years later, Grace, now a radiant, confident woman in her late 20s, stood on a small, rustic wooden stage at the heart of the Cooper and Grace Sanctuary. It was the annual Day of Hope celebration. Around her, children laughed, played, their faces, once etched with fear and pain, now alight with joy and newfound security. Therapy dogs, many of them graduates of the sanctuary's own program, moved among them, their tails wagging, their presence a calming, reassuring balm. An elderly, deeply contented Cooper lay at Grace's feet, his head resting on her shoe, his eyes closed in a peaceful doze. Grace smiled, her gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd of supporters, staff, volunteers, and, most importantly, the children whose lives had been touched, transformed, by this place of healing. She gently placed her hand on Cooper's noble, graying head. Many years ago, she began, her voice clear, strong, and infused with a profound, quiet emotion. I was lost in a darkness so profound, so terrifying, that I believed light and hope and love were things that no longer existed, at least not for me. But I was wrong. She looked down at the sleeping dog, her expression one of infinite tenderness. Cooper wasn't just my eyes in that darkness. Though he guided me when I could not see, he was, and he remains, my heart. He was my courage when I had none left. He is the beloved friend who, with every beat of his loyal, magnificent heart, taught me that even in the deepest, most suffocating abyss, love, true love, and unwavering loyalties can and will always, always ignite a light bright enough to guide you home. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the surrounding trees, carrying her words, her message of resilience, of the unbreakable, sacred bond between humans and animals, of an unshakable faith in the ultimate triumph of justice, and of the profound, transformative, and enduring healing power of unconditional love. Out into the waiting, hopeful world, the nightmare of the labyrinth was but a distant, fading echo, vanquished by the enduring, luminous light of a future reclaimed, a future dedicated to healing, to compassion, and to the quiet, extraordinary heroisms of a girl and her dog. This story left me with so many emotions: shock, fear, and a strange kind of hope. But now I want to hear from you. What did you feel watching Grace fight for her life? What do you think of Cooper's bravery? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if you enjoy stories like this, true, raw, and emotional, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. And here's a little gift from me. Tomorrow's story will take you somewhere even darker and even more powerful. She didn't scream the first time he turned on the camera. She didn't even flinch when the ice hit her skin. Maybe because by then, her body had forgotten how to react. But when she whispered "Cooper" into the darkness, that was the moment everything changed. This isn't just a story about a rich man and his secrets. This is about the silence between screams, about a blind girl locked in a high-tech labyrinth beneath a mansion, about a dog who understood evil better than any human ever could. What kind of father builds a maze? What kind of therapy gets live-streamed in the shadows of the deep web? And why did no one notice until it was almost too late? If you're still with me, I want to know what you think.